The whispers followed Thea Zanetti like a dark cloud as she walked down the main street of Marysville, Nevada Territory, in the spring of 1872. At 22, she had already weathered more storms than most folks twice her age, and the weight of the town's judgment pressed down on her slender shoulders with each step she took. "There she goes," someone muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "Damaged goods, that one." Thea kept her chin high, clutching her market basket tighter as she made her way past the general store. The label had been slapped on her 3 years ago when she returned to town, after being kidnapped by a gang of outlaws who had held her captive for nearly 2 months before the territorial marshals rescued her. Though she'd survived, the town had already decided her fate unmarriageable, tainted, an object of pity at best and scorn at worst. She approached Henderson's Mercantile, taking a deep breath before pushing open the door. The bell jingled cheerfully, announcing her presence, though the atmosphere inside immediately stiffened. Mrs. Henderson's pleasant smile faltered slightly before she forced it back into place. "Morning, Miss Zanetti. What can I help you with today? Just some flour and sugar, please. And perhaps some coffee if you've got any that isn't too dear." Thea placed her list on the counter, keeping her voice steady and polite as she'd trained herself to do. The door chimed again, and several sets of boots thudded against the wooden floor. Thea didn't turn around, knowing that acknowledging newcomers only invited unwanted attention. "Well, if it ain't the prettiest shop in all of Nevada Territory," came a deep, unfamiliar voice with a slight southern drawl. "Madam, you run a fine establishment, Mrs." Henderson's face transformed into a genuine smile. "Why, Mr. Grayson, didn't expect to see you in town so soon. How's that new ranch coming along?" "Slowly but surely, madam. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither will the double G be." The man chuckled, and Thea couldn't help but steal a glance. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who worked hard for a living. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the edges of his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a square jaw. When he smiled, it reached all the way to eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. Thea quickly looked away when those eyes shifted to her, but not before she saw the flicker of interest in them. "Don't believe we've met, miss," he said, stepping closer and removing his hat in one smooth motion. "Vaughn Grayson, new owner of what used to be the old Miller place about 5 miles west." Before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson intervened. "This is Miss Zanetti, Mr. Grayson. She lives with her father at the edge of town." Her tone carried a warning that most men in Marysville would have immediately understood. "Thea Zanetti," she said quietly, refusing to let someone else speak for her. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Grayson." His smile widened. "The pleasure's all mine, Miss Zanetti." He held her gaze a moment longer than was proper, showing no sign of having registered Mrs. Henderson's cautionary tone. Thea turned back to her shopping list, her cheeks burning. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her that way, like she was just a woman he found appealing, not a ruined thing to be avoided or pitied. "Your order, Miss Zanetti," Mrs. Henderson said, placing the items on the counter with unusual haste. "That'll be 78 cents. Thea counted out the coins carefully. Money was tight since her father's mining accident had left him with a permanent limp and limited his work. "Allow me," said Vaughn Grayson, placing $1 on the counter before she could protest. "I can pay my own way, Mr. Grayson," Thea said firmly, pushing her coins forward. "No doubt you can, Miss Zanetti." He didn't withdraw the $1. "But where I come from, it's considered good manners for a newcomer to make a friendly gesture to his neighbors, Mrs." Henderson looked between them, clearly uncomfortable. "Perhaps, Mr. Grayson, "You don't understand, I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice still pleasant but with a new edge to it. "I'm offering to pay for a neighbor's goods as a gesture of goodwill, nothing more or less." Thea studied him, trying to decipher his intentions. There was no leering or condescension in his expression, just simple directness. "Very well," she finally said, gathering her purchases. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Grayson." "You're welcome, Miss Zanetti." He tipped his hat. "Perhaps I'll see you around town again." As Thea left the store, she could hear Mrs. Henderson's hushed voice. "Mr. Grayson, there are things about Miss Zanetti you should know before you—" The door closed behind her, cutting off the rest of the woman's warning. Thea hurried away, her cheeks burning with humiliation. It would only be a matter of time before the newcomer learned about her past, and then he too would look at her with that mixture of pity and revulsion she'd grown accustomed to. The following Sunday found Thea sitting beside her father in their usual spot at the back of the church. Marysville's small wooden chapel was nearly full, as it was every week. Not everyone who attended was particularly devout, but church served as the social center of the community, and missing services without good reason was to invite speculation and gossip. Reverend Palmer was halfway through his sermon on redemption when the door creaked open. Heads turned as Vaughn Grayson slipped into the last available seat, 3 rows ahead of Thea. He nodded apologetically to the Reverend, who acknowledged him with a slight smile before continuing. Thea found her attention wandering from the sermon to the back of Grayson's head. His dark hair was neatly combed today, and he'd exchanged his work clothes for a proper suit, though it looked slightly worn at the elbows. She wondered if he'd heard about her by now. It had been nearly a week since their meeting at the Mercantile, plenty of time for someone to fill his ears with her sordid history. After the service, people gathered outside in small clusters, catching up on the week's news and making plans. Thea helped her father navigate the church steps, her arm linked through his. "Miss Zanetti," called a now familiar voice. "Mr. Zanetti, good morning to you both." Vaughn Grayson approached them, hat in hand. He looked directly at Thea's father, extending his hand. "Sir, I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Vaughn Grayson, recently of Virginia by way of Colorado. I've taken over the old Miller Ranch." Marco Zanetti, still handsome despite the lines of pain that had become permanent fixtures on his face since the mining accident, shook the offered hand. "Marco Zanetti, welcome to Marysville, Mr. Grayson." "Thank you, sir. I've already had the pleasure of meeting your daughter." Grayson turned his attention to Thea, that same direct gaze meeting hers without hesitation. "Miss Zanetti, you're looking well today." Thea's father glanced between them, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "You two have met, briefly, at Henderson's store," Thea explained. "Mr. Grayson was kind enough to pay for my purchases." Understanding dawned on Marco's face, followed quickly by the protective wariness Thea had come to recognize. Her father believed, as she did, that most men who showed interest in her now had dishonorable intentions, assuming she was loose, because of what had happened to her. "That was neighborly of you," Marco said, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm trying to get acquainted with the community," Grayson replied. "Actually, I was hoping I might call on you both sometime. I understand you're something of an expert on the local mining operations, Mr. Zanetti, and I've been considering whether there might be deposits worth exploring on my property." It was a transparent excuse, but one that appealed to her father's pride in his former profession. Before the accident, Marco had been a respected mine foreman with a talent for identifying promising veins. "I don't do much consulting these days," Marco said, gesturing to his bad leg. "All the more reason I should come to you, rather than dragging you out to my place," Grayson countered smoothly. Perhaps I could stop by tomorrow afternoon. I'd bring along some samples for you to look at." Thea saw the conflict on her father's face, the desire to be useful again warring with his protective instincts regarding his daughter. "I suppose that would be acceptable," Marco finally agreed. "Around 3 o'clock. Perfect. I look forward to it." Grayson smiled, his gaze sliding to Thea once more. "Until tomorrow, then." As he walked away, Thea could feel the stares of the church congregation. Most were directed at her with disapproval, some at Grayson with curiosity or concern. She heard Sheriff Wilson's wife murmur to her companion, "Someone ought to warn that poor man what he's getting himself into." "He's already been warned, Martha. Some men just can't resist a woman with a certain reputation." Thea flinched at the words. "Papa, perhaps we should head home," she said quietly. Marco nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, I think we've had enough fellowship for one day." The next afternoon, Thea found herself unnecessarily rearranging the already clean front room of their modest home. It wasn't a grand place, a simple 4-room cabin her father had built when they first arrived in Marysville 10 years ago, when the silver mines were booming, and before her mother had succumbed to tuberculosis. But it was neat and well-maintained, despite their reduced circumstances. At precisely 3 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Thea smoothed her best everyday dress, a simple blue calico she'd remade from one of her mother's old gowns, and went to answer it. Vaughn Grayson stood on their small porch, hat in hand. He'd foregone the Sunday suit in favor of clean work clothes, and he carried a leather satchel that presumably contained the rock samples he'd mentioned. "Good afternoon, Miss Zanetti," he said, his smile warm. "I hope I'm not too early." "You're right on time, Mr. Grayson. Please come in." She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "My father is waiting for you in the sitting room." Grayson paused in the doorway, his eyes moving around the modest but comfortable space. "You have a lovely home, Miss Zanetti." "Thank you," she replied, somewhat surprised by his apparent sincerity. Most of the wealthier townsfolk looked at their cabin with barely concealed disdain. "This way, please." She led him to where her father sat in his favorite chair near the window, where the light was good for reading. "Mr. Grayson," Marco greeted him, not attempting to rise. "Please have a seat." "Thank you for seeing me, sir." Grayson settled into the offered chair and opened his satchel. "I've brought some samples from different parts of the property. I'm no expert, but this one caught my attention." He pulled out a rock with faint glimmering streaks. Marco took it, turning it over in his hands with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades in the mines. This has promise. Where exactly did you find it?" As the men discussed geology and mining prospects, Thea excused herself to prepare coffee. In the kitchen, she could still hear their conversation, which had shifted from minerals to cattle ranching. "The land's good for grazing," Grayson was saying, "but I'm thinking of trying some new breeding stock. The Herefords are showing promise in Colorado, hardier than the Longhorns in bad winters." "Smart thinking," her father replied. "The winters here can be brutal if you're not prepared." Thea returned with the coffee tray, setting it on the small table between them. As she poured, she could feel Grayson's eyes on her, but when she glanced up, his gaze was respectful rather than invasive. "Miss Zanetti, I understand you're quite skilled with needlework," he said as she handed him a cup. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you sometimes take in sewing for extra income." Thea blinked in surprise. "Yes, I do, though the work has been somewhat scarce lately." The unspoken truth hung in the air. Many of the town's women no longer wanted her in their homes, around their husbands or sons. "Well, I find myself in need of someone with your talents," Grayson continued, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents. The previous owner left curtains that might have been fashionable during the Mexican War, and the bedding isn't much better. I'd be willing to pay fair market rate for new ones." Marco frowned slightly. "Mr. Grayson, I'd provide all the materials, of course," Grayson added quickly. "And I understand it might require some measurements of the windows and such. Perhaps you could both come out to the ranch sometime this week. I'd send my wagon for you to make it easier on your leg, Mr. Zanetti." Thea looked at her father, seeing the concern in his eyes but also the pragmatic calculation. They needed the money, and sewing for a bachelor's ranch was respectable enough work if properly chaperoned. "That's very thoughtful," she said before her father could refuse outright. "We would need to see the spaces to determine fabric requirements." Marco sighed slightly. "I suppose Wednesday might work if you're serious about the consulting as well." "Absolutely serious," Grayson assured him. "I value expert opinion, Mr. Zanetti, and you clearly know this area better than anyone." He turned to Thea. "And I'm desperately in need of civilizing influences at the ranch. The place is functional but hardly comfortable." "Then Wednesday it is," Thea said, ignoring the flutter in her stomach. It was just work, she reminded herself. Nothing more. As Grayson prepared to leave an hour later, he paused at the door. "Miss Zanetti, I nearly forgot. I picked these up when I was passing through Carson City last week." He pulled a small paper package from his pocket. "Thought they might come in handy for someone with your skills." Thea unwrapped the package to find half a dozen needles of varying sizes and a small pair of silver sewing scissors. They were simple but of good quality, the kind of practical tools any seamstress would appreciate. "That's very kind, Mr. Grayson," she said, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gift. "But I'm not sure I should accept, please," he interrupted gently. "Consider it an advance on your work, quality tools for quality craftsmanship." She glanced at her father, who gave a slight nod. "Thank you then. I'll put them to good use." After Grayson had gone, Marco looked at his daughter with concern. "Thea, are you certain about this? People will talk." "People already talk, Papa," she replied, her fingers running over the smooth metal of the scissors. "And we need the money. The truth is, I haven't had steady sewing work in months." Marco's face fell. "I'm sorry I can't provide better." "Don't," she interrupted, kneeling beside his chair. "You've done everything possible since Mama died and even more since I came back. We're managing just fine." "He seems decent enough," Marco admitted reluctantly. "But I've seen how men look at you now, even the so-called respectable ones." Thea swallowed hard. "Mr. Grayson doesn't look at me that way, at least I don't think he does." "That's what worries me," her father said softly. "If his intentions are honorable, he's either a fool who doesn't understand the ways of small towns, or he's hiding something himself." The word stung, though Thea knew her father meant well. In Marysville's eyes, no decent man would court a woman with her history unless he had serious flaws of his own. "It's just a business arrangement, Papa," she assured him, tucking the sewing notions into her work basket. "Nothing more." But as she prepared dinner that evening, Thea found herself humming a tune she hadn't sung since before the kidnapping, and wondering what colors might brighten the windows of Vaughn Grayson's ranch house. Wednesday dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day. Thea dressed with particular care in her second-best dress, a sage green that her mother had always said brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. She braided her chestnut hair and wound it into a neat coronet, then helped her father prepare for the outing. Precisely at 10 o'clock, a wagon pulled up outside their cabin. To Thea's surprise, Vaughn Grayson himself was driving rather than sending a ranch hand. He jumped down and approached their door, once again removing his hat as Thea opened it. "Good morning, Miss Zanetti," he said, his smile bright against his tanned skin. I hope I find you and your father well today." "Good morning, Mr. Grayson. We're quite well, thank you." She stepped aside. "Papa's just gathering his things." Marco appeared behind her, leaning heavily on his walking stick, but dressed in his good suit, the one he saved for special occasions. His silver, streaked dark hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his beard for the outing. "Mr. Zanetti," Grayson greeted him, extending a hand to help him navigate the steps. "I appreciate you making the trip out to the ranch. Let's see if my old expertise is worth anything before you start appreciating," Marco replied gruffly, but there was a hint of pride in his voice at being consulted professionally again. Grayson had padded the wagon seat with extra blankets for comfort, and he'd rigged a sturdy handrail to help Marco climb up. These small considerations weren't lost on Thea, who noted how he assisted her father with respect rather than pity. Once they were settled, Grayson climbed up and took the reins. "It's about a 40-minute drive," he explained as they set off. "Not too bad once you get used to it, but I'm thinking of investing in a proper buggy for trips to town." As they traveled, Grayson pointed out landmarks and shared his plans for the ranch. He'd purchased the 320-acre property for a surprisingly reasonable sum after the previous owner had given up and returned east. "The old man didn't understand the land," Grayson explained. "Tried to farm it like it was Ohio, then blamed Nevada when the crops failed. Good cattle country, though, if you know what you're doing." "And do you?" Marco asked directly. "Know what you're doing," Grayson laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I worked cattle in Texas and Colorado for 12 years, sir. Started as a hand, worked up to foreman, saved every penny until I had enough for my own place." His expression grew more serious. "I've made my share of mistakes, but I learn from them." "A wise philosophy," Marco conceded, visibly relaxing. They crested a small rise, and suddenly the ranch spread before them, a collection of buildings nestled in a natural hollow, protected from the worst of the winds by gentle slopes on 3 sides. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods offering welcome shade. "There she is," Grayson said with undisguised pride. "The Double G." The main house was larger than Thea had expected, a solid 2-story structure built of local stone and timber. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and smoke curled from one of 2 chimneys. Several outbuildings stood nearby: a barn, bunkhouse, storage sheds, and corrals where a dozen or so horses grazed. "It's lovely," Thea said sincerely. "How many hands do you employ?" "Just 3 so far: Johnson, Tanner, and Lewis. Good men, all of them. We'll need more once I increase the herd, but for now we're managing." As they approached, a lean, weathered man in his 40s emerged from the barn. "That's Johnson, my foreman," Grayson explained. "Been with me since Colorado." Johnson waved and came over to help Marco down from the wagon while Grayson assisted Thea. "Miss Zanetti, Mr. Zanetti, this is Caleb Johnson. Caleb, these are our neighbors I mentioned." "Madam, sir," Johnson tipped his hat respectfully. "Boss has been talking about your visit all week. Even had us clean the place top to bottom." There was good-natured teasing in his tone, and Thea noticed Grayson's ears reddened slightly. "A clean house is easier to measure for curtains," Grayson replied with dignity. "And Mr. Zanetti is here to consult on the property's mineral potential." "Whatever you say, boss." Johnson winked at Thea when Grayson's back was turned, then offered his arm to Marco. "Sir, if you'd like, I can show you the rock samples while the boss gives the lady the grand tour. They're sorted in the tack room." Marco hesitated, glancing at Thea. "The main house has all its doors and windows open," Grayson said quietly, understanding the unspoken concern. "And Johnson's wife will be joining us for lunch. She rides over from the neighboring property where she works as housekeeper. I assure you, Everything is completely proper." After a moment, Marco nodded. "Very well. Lead on, Mr. Johnson." As the men headed toward the barn, Grayson turned to Thea. "Shall we start with the house?" The interior of the ranch house was spacious but spartanly furnished, much as Grayson had described. The previous owner had left behind heavy, outdated furniture and faded curtains that had seen better days. The rooms were clean but lacked warmth and personality. "The place has good bones," Thea observed as they moved from room to room, her notebook filling with measurements and ideas. "But it needs softening." "That's exactly what I thought," Grayson agreed, following her as she examined the windows in what appeared to be a rarely used formal parlor. "I know cattle and horses, but this," he gestured around the room, "isn't my area of expertise. What colors do you prefer?" Thea asked, businesslike despite her awareness of him standing nearby. "I hadn't given it much thought," he admitted. "Nothing too fancy or fussy, something welcoming, I suppose, comfortable. Blues and greens, perhaps. They'd complement the stone walls and bring in the colors from outside." She moved to the next window, stretching to measure the upper frame. "Here, allow me." Grayson reached up easily to hold the measuring tape against the top of the window frame, his arm brushing against hers. Thea stepped back quickly, nearly dropping her notebook. The brief contact had sent an unexpected tingle through her body, reminding her how long it had been since she'd been this close to a man who wasn't her father. If Grayson noticed her reaction, he didn't comment on it. "Blue sounds nice. My mother had blue curtains in our home in Virginia before the war." Something in his voice made Thea look at him more carefully. "You fought in the war," he nodded, his expression sobering. "Confederate cavalry. Joined up in '63 when I was 18, fought until Appomattox." He ran a hand through his hair, a self-conscious gesture. "Not something I talk about much out here. The war feels very far away in Nevada." "My father came from Italy to avoid military service there," Thea offered. "He believes men should choose their own battles." "A wise man, your father." Grayson moved to the next window. "After the war, there wasn't much left for me in Virginia. My family lost everything: the farm, our horses, my two older brothers." His voice remained steady, but Thea could hear the old grief beneath the words. "Headed west to start fresh, like so many others." "I'm sorry about your brothers," she said softly. He shrugged, but his eyes showed that her sympathy meant something. "Life goes on. You either move forward or you don't." He cleared his throat. "Anyway, I'm boring you with ancient history when we should be discussing curtains and bedding." They continued through the house, Thea making notes and suggestions, Grayson listening attentively to her ideas. By the time they reached the kitchen, she had filled several pages with measurements and fabric requirements. "Mrs. Johnson will be here shortly with lunch," Grayson said, glancing at the clock on the mantel. "Is there anything else you need to see?" "I think I have everything," Thea replied, reviewing her notes. "Though I should consult with my father about timing. This is quite a large project." "I'm in no rush," Grayson assured her. "Quality work takes time." The back door opened and a plump, cheerful woman in her 40s entered carrying a basket. "Mr. Grayson, I hope I'm not late." "Right on time, Mrs. Johnson. May I present Miss Zanetti?" "Miss Zanetti, this is Caleb's wife, Martha Johnson." Martha's friendly face showed no sign of recognition or judgment as she shook Thea's hand. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Zanetti. I've brought a chicken pie and some fresh bread for lunch." "It smells wonderful," Thea said truthfully, realizing suddenly that she was hungry. "Let me help you set up," Grayson offered, taking the basket from Martha. "Miss Zanetti, shall we find your father?" They found Marco and Johnson deep in conversation over rock samples spread across a workbench in the barn. Marco looked more animated than Thea had seen him in years, pointing to various specimens with authoritative gestures. "And this one here, you see the coloration. That's promising." "Where exactly on the property did you find it?" "Lunch is ready," Grayson announced, clearly pleased to see Marco so engaged. "But we can certainly continue this discussion over food." They ate at the large kitchen table, the conversation flowing easily between geology, ranching, and local news. Thea found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did outside her own home. Neither of the Johnsons showed any sign of having heard about her past, treating her with simple friendliness that felt like cool water after a long drought. After the meal, Martha insisted on clearing up while Grayson showed Marco a map of the property marking areas that might warrant further exploration. Thea helped with the dishes, grateful for the older woman's unforced companionship. "The boss seems taken with you," Martha commented quietly as they worked. Thea nearly dropped the plate she was drying. "I'm sure you're mistaken. Mr. Grayson is simply being neighborly." Martha gave her a knowing look. "I've known that man for 4 years, Miss Zanetti. Worked for him in Colorado before we came here. I've never seen him clean a house for neighborly reasons before." "Even if that were true," Thea replied, keeping her voice low, "it wouldn't be appropriate. Because of whatever has the people in town whispering when your name comes up." Martha asked directly but not unkindly. Thea's hand stilled on the dish towel. "You've heard, then?" "Bits and pieces. Nothing specific. Small towns run on gossip, and my husband and I stop in Marysville for supplies every few weeks." Martha's weathered hands continued steadily washing dishes. "Whatever it is, Miss Zanetti, I learned long ago not to judge people by rumors." "It's not just rumors," Thea said quietly. 3 years ago, I was kidnapped by a gang of outlaws who held me for ransom. When I was rescued, well, certain assumptions were made about what happened during my captivity." "And were those assumptions correct?" Martha asked, her tone neutral. Thea swallowed hard. "No, the gang leader kept me separated from the others, he said. He said he didn't allow his men to damage the merchandise. They were hoping for a significant ransom from my father, who was more prosperous then." She'd never spoken so frankly about it to anyone outside her family. But the town decided otherwise. It was easier to believe I was ruined. Martha shook her head, disgust evident in her expression. "People can be cruel, especially to young women. My first husband spread vicious lies about me after I left him for striking me once too often. I had to move 3 towns away to escape the stories." "I'm sorry that happened to you," Thea said sincerely. "Ancient history now," Martha replied with a smile. "Caleb knows the truth, and that's what matters." She glanced toward the men at the table. "Mr. Grayson is a good judge of character, Miss Zanetti. He wouldn't care what the gossips say." "It's not just gossip anymore," Thea said softly. "It's become my identity in Marysville. That poor Zanetti girl, damaged goods. I've learned to live with it." "Living with something isn't the same as accepting it as truth," Martha replied, handing her the last plate. "Just something to consider." The ride back to town was pleasant, with Marco talking more animatedly than he had in months about the mineral prospects of Grayson's land. "There's definite potential for a small silver operation on the North Ridge," he explained, gesturing with his hands. "Nothing like the big commercial mines, but possibly enough to supplement the ranch income significantly." "That's valuable information, Mr. Zanetti. I'd be happy to pay you for a more thorough survey if you're willing." Grayson glanced at him. "At your convenience and comfort level, of course." "I'd like that," Marco said, a spark of purpose in his eyes that warmed Thea's heart. "It's been too long since I've done real mining work." They agreed on terms, and by the time they reached the Zanetti cabin, arrangements had been made for Marco to return to the ranch the following week for a more extensive survey, with Grayson providing transportation. As Grayson helped Marco down from the wagon, he turned to Thea. "And the curtains, Miss Zanetti. How soon might you be able to start on those?" "I can purchase the fabric in Carson City," she replied. "There's a stage that runs twice weekly. Once I have the materials, the work should take about 3 weeks, depending on how elaborate you want the designs." "Nothing fancy, as I said, simple but well made." He reached into his pocket and produced an envelope. "An advance for materials and your time. Please let me know if it's not sufficient." Thea hesitated before accepting the envelope. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I'll provide a detailed accounting of expenses, of course." "I trust your judgment completely, Miss Zanetti." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he tipped his hat. "I look forward to seeing what you create." As the wagon pulled away, Marco looked at his daughter with a mixture of concern and resignation. "He seems genuinely interested in you, Thea." "He's being kind, Papa, nothing more," Marco sighed. "I've seen the way he looks at you. It's not just kindness." Thea felt a flutter in her chest that she quickly suppressed. "Even if that were true, you know as well as I do that nothing can come of it. The moment someone tells him about my past—" "Perhaps," her father interrupted gently, "we should let Mr. Grayson decide that for himself." The next morning, Thea took the early stage to Carson City, the envelope of advance money securely tucked in her reticule. The larger town offered a much better selection of fabrics than Marysville's general store, and she spent several pleasant hours selecting materials for Grayson's curtains and bedding sturdy cotton prints in shades of blue and green for the main rooms, heavier materials for winter drafts, and good quality muslin for the bedroom linens. She was examining a bolt of particularly handsome indigo fabric when a voice behind her made her jump. "That would look very fine against the stone walls, I think." Thea whirled to find Vaughn Grayson standing a few feet away, hat in hand and an amused smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Grayson, what are you doing in Carson City?" "Banking business," he replied, stepping closer to examine the fabric she'd been considering. "And I needed to order some equipment that Henderson's doesn't carry. I didn't expect to find you here." "I'm selecting materials for your curtains," she explained, somewhat flustered by his sudden appearance. "Carson City has a much better selection." "So I see." He ran a finger along the edge of the indigo fabric. "I like this one." "It's for your study," Thea said. "I thought the color would work well with the leather chair and desk." "You have a good eye, Miss Zanetti." His gaze shifted from the fabric to her face. "Have you had lunch? I was just headed to the hotel dining room and I'd be honored if you joined me." Thea hesitated. Dining alone with a man in a public establishment would certainly fuel gossip if anyone from Marysville saw them, but Carson City was large enough that she might reasonably expect anonymity. "I wouldn't want to impose on your business day," she demurred. "It would be a welcome break, I assure you." His smile was warm. "Unless you'd prefer to eat alone," the thought of a proper restaurant meal was tempting. She rarely ate out, both for financial reasons and because of the uncomfortable stares she often received in Marysville's only café. "Very well, Mr. Grayson. Thank you for the invitation." After arranging for her purchases to be wrapped and held for later pickup, Thea accompanied Grayson to the International Hotel, a relatively grand establishment by Nevada Territory standards. The dining room was busy but not crowded, and the maitre d' showed them to a small table near a window overlooking the street. Thea was acutely aware of how out of place she must look in her simple traveling dress, but Grayson seemed completely at ease, treating her as if she were dressed in the finest silks. "Order whatever appeals to you," he encouraged as she scanned the menu with its surprisingly varied offerings. "The beefsteak here is excellent, and they do a fine chicken fricassee." They settled on their selections, and as they waited for the food to arrive, Grayson steered the conversation to safe, pleasant topics: the spring weather, the latest books he'd ordered from San Francisco, Thea's ideas for the curtain designs. Not once did he pry into her past or make comments that could be construed as too personal. It wasn't until they were enjoying coffee and apple pie that he said, "Miss Zanetti, there's something I'd like to discuss with you." Thea's stomach tightened. Here it comes, she thought. Someone has told him. "Mrs. Henderson approached me yesterday after church," he continued, his expression serious. "She felt it was her Christian duty to inform me about certain events in your past." Thea set down her coffee cup, her hand trembling slightly. "I see." "She seemed quite concerned about my association with you and your father," he continued, his tone neutral. "Apparently, there are those in town who feel I should be warned about your reputation." The familiar humiliation washed over Thea, burning her cheeks and making her throat tight. She started to rise. "Thank you for lunch, Mr. Grayson, but I should, please," he said, his hand moving toward hers but stopping just short of touching it. "I'm not finished." Reluctantly, she sat back down, bracing herself for the awkward withdrawal of his business arrangement, the carefully worded suggestion that perhaps someone else might be better suited to sew his curtains. "I told Mrs. Henderson," Grayson continued, his voice low but clear, "that I am fully capable of forming my own opinions about the character of my neighbors, and that, furthermore, I found her gossiping to be far more objectionable than anything she imagined about you." Thea stared at him, not quite comprehending. "You, what?" "I believe I used the phrase narrow-minded interference at one point," he added, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. "She didn't take it well." "Mr. Grayson," Thea began, struggling to find words. "I don't think you understand the situation fully. 3 years ago, I was kidnapped by outlaws and held for nearly 2 months before being rescued by territorial marshals," he finished for her. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson was quite detailed in her account, including the town's assumptions about what occurred during your captivity. And you don't. That doesn't." Thea couldn't bring herself to complete the question. Grayson leaned forward slightly, his amber eyes serious. "Miss Zanetti, I spent 2 years fighting in a war where I saw the best and worst of humanity. I spent another 7 years working cattle drives where men's characters were tested daily. I've learned to judge people by their actions and their integrity, not by rumors or circumstance." He paused, his expression softening. "From what I've observed, you are a woman of remarkable strength and dignity who has faced unconscionable treatment from people who should know better. Nothing Mrs. Henderson said changed that assessment. If anything, it only increased my admiration for how you've carried yourself." Thea felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. "Most men wouldn't see it that way," she said quietly. "Then most men are fools," Grayson replied simply. "I don't mean to speak out of turn, Miss Zanetti, but I find your company refreshing and your character admirable. I would very much like to continue our acquaintance, both professionally and, if you're willing, socially." The directness of his statement left her momentarily speechless. "Mr. Grayson, you must realize that associating with me socially will not be viewed kindly by many in Marysville." "I'm well aware," he acknowledged with a slight smile. "Fortunately, I'm not particularly concerned with the good opinion of people who would shun a woman for surviving a terrible ordeal." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small parcel, placing it on the table between them. "I found this at the general store here and thought of you. Please consider it a small token of my esteem, entirely separate from our business arrangement." Hesitantly, Thea unwrapped the package to find a beautiful bone crochet hook with a delicately carved handle. It was a thoughtful gift for someone who worked with textiles, useful but also finely crafted. "It's lovely," she said softly. "But I'm not sure I should accept a simple gift between friends," he interrupted gently. "Nothing more unless you wish it to be." The implication hung in the air between them, neither pushing nor demanding, but open with possibility. Thea studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincere regard. "Thank you," she finally said, carefully rewrapping the crochet hook. "It's very thoughtful." "You're welcome, Miss Zanetti," he signaled for the check. "Now may I escort you back to the fabric shop? I find I'm suddenly very interested in the curtains for my dining room." Over the next few weeks, a pattern developed. Marco Zanetti visited the Double G Ranch twice weekly to survey the property's mineral potential, always transported in Grayson's wagon, and always returning with positive reports about the work and their host. Thea divided her time between sewing at home and making periodic visits to the ranch to check measurements and ensure her work would fit properly. Grayson was unfailingly respectful during these interactions, never once overstepping the bounds of propriety. He made a point of having Martha Johnson present whenever Thea visited, and he treated Marco with genuine respect that went beyond mere courtesy. Despite these precautions, the gossip in Marysville intensified. Thea could feel the stares and whispers whenever she walked through town, and on one occasion, she overheard Mrs. Wilson telling another woman, "That Zanetti girl has set her cap for the newcomer. Poor man probably doesn't realize what he's getting." The words stung, but Thea found they didn't cut as deeply as they once might have. Something about Grayson's steady regard and unshakable respect had begun to rebuild the confidence that 3 years of whispers had eroded. One afternoon in late May, Thea arrived at the ranch with the first completed set of curtains for the parlor. Martha had ridden over to help with the installation, and the three of them worked together to hang the blue-green fabric that immediately transformed the formerly austere room into a welcoming space. "They're perfect," Grayson said, stepping back to admire the effect. "Exactly what this place needed. The color brings out the grain in the floorboards," Martha observed approvingly. "You've got a gift, Miss Zanetti." "Thank you," Thea replied, genuinely pleased with the result. "I'll have the dining room set finished by next week." As they were packing up the sewing supplies, a ranch hand appeared at the door. "Boss, there's a situation with that new bull. Johnson says you'd better come quick." "Excuse me, ladies," Grayson said, immediately moving toward the door. "Duty calls." Martha laughed after he'd gone. "Always something with livestock. I'd better check if Caleb needs any medical supplies ready." She turned to Thea. "Will you be all right for a few minutes? I shouldn't be long." "Of course," Thea assured her. "I'll just finish tidying up here." Left alone in the parlor, Thea took a moment to truly appreciate how different the room looked with her handiwork adorning the windows. There was something deeply satisfying about transforming a space with nothing more than fabric and thread, about creating beauty where before there had been only functionality. She was adjusting the drape of one panel when she heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of boots on the wooden floor. "That was quick," she called, assuming Grayson had returned. "Well, look who's playing house at the Double G." The voice was unfamiliar and sent an immediate chill down Thea's spine. She turned to find 3 men standing in the parlor doorway. They weren't ranch hands, judging by their city clothes and the way they carried themselves too stiff, too self-important for men who worked the land. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but Mr. Grayson isn't here at the moment," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If you'd like to wait for him, I can." "Oh, we know he's out with the cattle," the leader said, a tall man with cold eyes and an expensive suit. That's why we thought it was a good time to stop by and have a chat with you, Miss Zanetti. The fact that he knew her name made the situation even more unsettling. I don't believe we've been introduced, sir. Silas Blackwell, he replied with a mock bow. I own the Blackwell Mining Company. These are my associates, Mr. Reed and Mr. Flint. Thea had heard of Blackwell, everyone in mining country had. His company had been buying up claims and small operations throughout Nevada for the past few years, not always through entirely ethical means, according to her father. What business could you possibly have with me, Mr. Blackwell? She asked, subtly shifting toward the door to the kitchen, where she might find Martha. We're here to deliver a message for your father, Blackwell replied, moving further into the room. We understand he's been surveying Mr. Grayson's property for mineral deposits. That's hardly a secret, Thea said. My father is a respected mining expert. Blackwell chuckled, the sound entirely devoid of humor. Was a respected mining expert. Now he's a cripple playing at consultancy. But that's neither here nor there. The message is simple. Marco Zanetti needs to discourage his employer from pursuing any mining operations on this property. Thea straightened her spine, anger replacing her initial fear. And why would he do that? Because, Blackwell said, his voice dropping, I've already laid claim to the mineral rights in this entire valley. Grayson only purchased the surface rights to this property. If he starts digging, he'll find himself in very expensive legal trouble. That's impossible, Thea protested. The deed says exactly what I'm telling you, Blackwell interrupted smoothly. Your father should check the county records more carefully, and so should Grayson. One of the other men, Reed, stepped forward. It would be a shame if your father wasted what little professional reputation he has left on a losing proposition, Miss Zanetti, particularly given your family's precarious social standing. The threat was clear. Thea felt cold anger washing through her. I'll convey your message to my father, Mr. Blackwell. Now, if you'll excuse me, we're not finished, Blackwell said, moving to block her path to the door. There's also the matter of your relationship with Mr. Grayson. I don't see how that's any concern of yours, Thea replied, her voice tight. Everything in this valley is my concern, Miss Zanetti. Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Grayson is a newcomer who doesn't understand how things work here. He needs the right influences. A woman of questionable reputation is hardly the proper companion for a man trying to establish himself. The third man, Flint, snickered. Though I can see why he keeps you around. Pretty little thing, even if you are damaged goods. Before Thea could respond, a new voice cut through the room, cold as steel. I suggest you step away from Miss Zanetti immediately. Vaughn Grayson stood in the doorway, his normally warm eyes hard as flint. Behind him stood Johnson and another ranch hand, both looking equally displeased. Blackwell turned, his expression smoothly transforming into one of cordial business interest. Ah, Mr. Grayson, I was just introducing myself to your seamstress. Silas Blackwell, Blackwell Mining Company. I know who you are, Grayson replied, stepping into the room. What I don't know is why you're in my home, harassing my guest. A simple business discussion that concerns both our interests, Blackwell said dismissively. I was explaining to Miss Zanetti that there appears to be some confusion regarding the mineral rights to your property. There's no confusion, Grayson said flatly. I checked the records thoroughly before purchasing this ranch. The mineral rights are included in my deed. A flicker of surprise crossed Blackwell's face before he masked it. I think you'll find there's been a recent amendment to those records. Funny how records sometimes get amended after a sale, isn't it? Grayson's voice was dangerously calm. Almost as if someone altered them. Blackwell's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Grayson. Not nearly as serious as trespassing, intimidation, and threatening a lady under my protection, Grayson countered. Johnson, please escort Mr. Blackwell and his associates to their horses. If they resist, you have my permission to assist them more forcefully. Johnson stepped forward, his weathered hand resting casually near the gun at his hip. Gentlemen, for a tense moment, Thea thought Blackwell might refuse to leave, but after a calculating look at Grayson and his men, he adjusted his coat and nodded to his companions. This isn't the end of the matter, Grayson, he said as he moved toward the door. You'd be wise to consider my position carefully. And you'd be wise to never set foot on my property again, Grayson replied evenly. Johnson, see them out. As the men were escorted away, Grayson immediately moved to Thea's side. Are you all right? Did they harm you? I'm fine, she assured him, though her hands were trembling slightly. They just said some unpleasant things. Grayson's jaw tightened. I can imagine. Blackwell has a reputation for using any leverage he can find, including personal matters. Martha bustled in from the kitchen, looking alarmed. I heard voices. What's happened? Briefly, Grayson explained the situation while Thea collected herself. The confrontation had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, bringing back uncomfortable memories of feeling powerless and at the mercy of men's judgments. I should return to town, she said when he'd finished. My father needs to know about this. Of course, Grayson agreed. But you shouldn't travel alone. I'll drive you myself. That's not necessary, please, Thea, he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. I'd feel better knowing you're safe. The drive back to Marysville was initially quiet, both of them processing the confrontation with Blackwell. Finally, Grayson broke the silence. I'm sorry you were subjected to that, he said, his hands tight on the reins. Blackwell is exactly the kind of man who gives business a bad name. He seemed very confident about the mineral rights, Thea replied. Are you certain your deed is secure? Absolutely certain. I had a lawyer in Carson City review everything before I signed. But Blackwell has connections in the county offices. It wouldn't be the first time records have mysteriously changed to suit his interests. What will you do? Grayson's expression was determined. First, I'll have my lawyer check the current records. If they've been altered, we'll fight it legally. Blackwell's not the only one with connections. He glanced at her, his expression softening. I'm more concerned about what they said to you. Blackwell's known for finding people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. Thea looked away, unable to meet his gaze. They said what people have been saying for 3 years, that I'm damaged goods, that I'm not a suitable companion for a respectable man. Grayson's hands tightened on the reins. Thea, look at me. Reluctantly, she turned toward him. His eyes held such intensity that it nearly took her breath away. I don't see damaged goods when I look at you, he said quietly. I see treasure. A woman of remarkable strength, dignity, and talent. Don't let men like Blackwell make you doubt your worth. The words struck deep, piercing through layers of hurt and shame that Thea had built up over years of judgment and whispers. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the simple, profound affirmation. Thank you, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. They arrived at the Zanetti cabin to find Marco on the porch, clearly worried by their unexpected return. As they related the encounter with Blackwell, his face darkened with anger and concern. That snake, he muttered. I've heard stories about his tactics, but I never thought he'd approach my daughter. I think we should check the county records immediately, Grayson said. If Blackwell has tampered with them, we need to act quickly. Marco nodded grimly. I agree. The land office closes at 5 if we leave now. We can make it. I'm coming with you, Thea insisted, and neither man argued. At the county land office in Marysville, the clerk, a nervous young man named Perkins, initially claimed he couldn't find the double GTCS records. It wasn't until Grayson mentioned involving the territorial marshal that the files mysteriously appeared. "Just as I thought," Grayson said grimly, examining the deed. "Look here, this clause about mineral rights has been altered. The ink is different and the handwriting doesn't match the rest of the document." Marco leaned in, his expert eye confirming the assessment. "Clumsy work, too. A judge would spot this immediately." "Mr. Perkins," Grayson said to the increasingly uncomfortable clerk, "I'd like to know who accessed these records recently and on whose authority." The young man swallowed hard. "Sir, I can't—" "You can and you will," Marco interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of his former position. "Or we'll take this matter directly to Judge Carlton, along with our suspicions about your involvement." Faced with this threat, Perkins crumbled. "Mr. Blackwell came by yesterday with Mr. Flint. He said he had a legal right to examine the documents and make certain annotations that had been overlooked during filing. And you allowed this without verification from a judge or the original parties to the deed." Grayson's tone was incredulous. "Mr. Blackwell is very influential in the county," Perkins replied weakly. "He implied my job might depend on my cooperation." Grayson's expression hardened. "Well, Mr. Perkins, I suggest you consider how your job might fare when a judge learns you allowed legal documents to be tampered with. I want the original deed retrieved and verified immediately, and I want a statement from you acknowledging what happened here." By the time they left the land office, they had secured both the original, unaltered deed and a written confession from Perkins detailing Blackwell's actions. It was enough, Grayson believed, to not only secure his claim but potentially bring charges against Blackwell for document tampering. "He won't take this lying down," Marco warned as they headed back to the cabin in the fading light. "Blackwell didn't get where he is by accepting defeat gracefully." "Let him come," Grayson replied, his voice steady. "I've faced worse than a corrupt businessman with delusions of grandeur." Over dinner at the Zanetti cabin, Grayson had insisted on treating them to steaks from the town's small restaurant as a thank you for their help. They discussed strategy. Grayson would take the evidence to his lawyer in Carson City, while Marco would continue surveying the property to establish exactly what minerals might be present. "And what about the curtains?" Thea asked, attempting to lighten the mood. "With all this excitement, I still have half your house to finish." Grayson smiled, the tension in his face easing. "The curtains remain a priority, Miss Zanetti. A man can fight for his property rights and still appreciate a well-appointed home." As he prepared to leave later that evening, Grayson lingered on the porch with Thea while Marco tactfully busied himself inside. "I meant what I said earlier," Grayson told her, his voice low. "About seeing treasure where others see something damaged." Thea felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "You hardly know me, Mr. Grayson." "I know enough," he replied simply, "and I'd like to know more if you'll permit it." "People will talk," she warned, though the old fear in her voice had been replaced by something closer to resignation. "People already talk." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. "Thea, I'm not asking for anything improper. Just the chance to court you properly, with your father's permission and with all due respect to propriety." The warmth of his hand around hers sent a pleasant shiver through her body. "Why? Why would you invite the judgment that comes with associating with me?" "Because in the time I've known you, I've seen a woman of remarkable character, talent, and grace." "Because you make me laugh and think and want to be a better man." His thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand. "And because I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time, if ever." The simple honesty in his voice broke through the last of Thea's defenses. "I'd like that," she whispered. "To be courted properly, I mean." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then I'll speak with your father tomorrow." He lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Thea Zanetti." "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, testing the feel of his first name on her lips and finding it pleasant indeed. The following weeks brought significant changes to Thea's life. True to his word, Vaughn formally requested Marco's permission to court her, which was granted with a mixture of caution and hope. Their courtship proceeded with careful attention to propriety-chaperoned outings, visits to the ranch where Martha was always present, and Sunday dinners at the Zanetti cabin. As June bloomed into July, so too did their relationship deepen. Vaughn never pressed for more than Thea was ready to give, seeming content with conversation, shared interests, and the occasional touch of hands. He brought her books from his own collection, listened intently to her ideas, and treated her opinions with genuine respect. The legal battle with Blackwell intensified when Vaughn's lawyer filed formal complaints with both the county court and the territorial authorities. Blackwell responded with a countersuit claiming prior rights to the minerals under the Double G, but his case was weakened considerably by Perkins's statement and the obvious tampering with the deed. One evening in mid-July, Vaughn invited Thea and her father to the ranch for a special dinner. "The dining room curtains are finally installed," he explained, "and I'd like to celebrate with the people who made it possible." When they arrived, Thea was stunned to find the ranch house transformed. The curtains she'd sewn hung perfectly in every window, but Vaughn had added other touches as well: new tablecloths, cushions for the hard chairs, and even a collection of wildflowers arranged in mason jars on every available surface. "It's wonderful," she breathed, taking in the changes. "It looks like a real home." "That was the goal," Vaughn replied, watching her reaction with evident pleasure. "Though I have to admit, Johnson and the boys thought I'd lost my mind when I started picking flowers." The dinner was a festive affair, with Martha outdoing herself on a roast beef with all the trimmings. The Johnsons joined them, along with the other ranch hands, creating a warm, family atmosphere that reminded Thea of holidays before her mother's death. After dinner, while the others lingered over coffee, Vaughn invited Thea to step onto the porch for some air. Marco gave a subtle nod of permission, and she followed Vaughn outside into the soft summer evening. The sky was ablaze with stars, the air still warm but comfortable after the heat of the day. They stood side by side at the porch railing, looking out over the darkened ranch. "I have something for you," Vaughn said after a moment, reaching into his pocket. "A thank you for transforming this place into a home." He handed her a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. Thea opened it to find a delicate silver bracelet set with small turquoise stones. "Vaughn, it's beautiful," she whispered, lifting it from the box. "But this is too much for just sewing curtains." "It's not for the curtains," he replied softly. "It's for bringing light back into my life when I didn't even realize how much I needed it." He took the bracelet from her fingers and carefully fastened it around her wrist. "I was existing, not living, before I came to Marysville. Building the ranch, going through the motions, but not really connecting with anyone or anything." His fingers lingered on her wrist, the touch sending warmth through her entire body. "Then I met a woman with wounded eyes and a spine of steel, who faced down gossip and judgment with more dignity than those who judged her could ever understand." Thea looked up at him, her heart pounding. "You make me sound much braver than I am." "I see you exactly as you are, Thea Zanetti." His voice was low and intense. "Brave, yes, but also kind, talented, witty, and more beautiful to me with each passing day. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and brushed his lips against hers in the gentlest of kisses. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sent sparks through Thea's entire body. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I needed you to know that." The words she'd never expected to hear from any man, let alone one like Vaughn Grayson, momentarily robbed her of speech. When she found her voice again, it came out as little more than a whisper. "I think I'm falling in love with you too." His smile was radiant in the starlight. "Then I'm the luckiest man in Nevada territory." They returned inside shortly after, both a little flushed but happy. If Marco noticed the new bracelet on his daughter's wrist or the way her eyes shone, he made no comment, but there was a softening in his expression as he watched her. On the drive back to town, Marco finally spoke about what was becoming increasingly obvious. "He's a good man, Thea. Better than I dared hope you might find." "He is," she agreed softly. "But the town can go hang," her father interrupted with unexpected vehemence. "I've watched you shrink yourself for 3 years to accommodate their judgment. I won't see you give up a chance at happiness for fear of wagging tongues." Thea was startled by his fervor. "Papa, I've never heard you speak that way." Marco sighed, suddenly looking his age in the moonlight. "I blame myself for not protecting you better from the kidnapping, from the gossip afterward. I let fear for our livelihood keep me from standing up for you as I should have." "No, Papa," Thea protested. "You've always supported me." "Not loudly enough," he replied sadly. "But Grayson does. He doesn't hide his regard for you or apologize for it. That's the kind of man you deserve." The following Sunday, Vaughn attended church with them, sitting boldly beside Thea in the Zanetti's usual pew. The whispers were immediate and obvious, but Vaughn seemed entirely untroubled by them. His attention focused on the service and occasionally on Thea's profile beside him. Afterward, as they stood outside the church, Mrs. Wilson approached, her expression pinched with disapproval. "Mr. Grayson," she said, pointedly ignoring Thea. "I believe we haven't been formally introduced. I'm Esther Wilson, the sheriff's wife." "Madam," Vaughn replied with perfect courtesy, though his hand came to rest supportively at the small of Thea's back. "A pleasure. I was wondering if you might consider joining us for Sunday dinner next week," Mrs. Wilson continued. "We often invite newcomers to welcome them properly to Marysville." The implication was clear. She was offering him a socially acceptable alternative to the company he was currently keeping. Thea felt herself stiffen, but before she could react, Vaughn's response came smooth as silk. "That's very kind, Mrs. Wilson, but I'm afraid my Sundays are spoken for." His smile remained pleasant, though his eyes had cooled considerably. "Miss Zanetti and her father have been gracious enough to include me in their Sunday meals, and I wouldn't dream of disappointing them." Mrs. Wilson's smile turned brittle. "I see. Well, perhaps another time when you're less committed." "I don't foresee my commitments changing any time soon," Vaughn replied, his meaning unmistakable. "But I appreciate the invitation nonetheless." As Mrs. Wilson stalked away, Thea released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You'll make enemies that way," she warned quietly. "I prefer honest enemies to false friends," he replied, his hand still warm against her back. "Besides, your father makes an excellent Sunday roast. I wouldn't miss it for all the social connections in Nevada." The confrontation with Mrs. Wilson proved to be just the beginning. As Vaughn's courtship of Thea became increasingly public, the town divided in its response. Some, like Reverend Palmer and a few of the more fair-minded citizens, offered cautious support. Others made their disapproval clear through snubs, whispers, and occasionally more direct means. Henderson refused to extend Vaughn the usual credit at the mercantile, forcing him to pay cash for all purchases. Sheriff Wilson suddenly found reasons to scrutinize the brands on Grayson cattle being driven to market. Even the bank manager in Marysville became mysteriously reluctant to handle transactions related to the Double G. Through it all, Vaughn remained unflappable. He took his business to Carson City when Marysville merchants proved difficult. He invited the territorial brand inspector to the ranch to verify his paperwork was in order, neutralizing Sheriff Wilson's interference. And he simply transferred his banking to a larger institution in Carson City, where his family name still carried weight from pre-war connections. "They're trying to break you," Thea said one evening as they sat on her porch swing, Marco dozing in his chair nearby. "To force you to choose between me and your standing in the community. Then they fundamentally misunderstand what matters to me," Vaughn replied, his arm around her shoulders. "I didn't come west to win popularity contests, Thea. I came to build something lasting, something of my own. The Double G is part of that, but not all of it." His fingers traced idle patterns on her sleeve. "The truth is, I was lonely before I met you. Successful, yes, and building the ranch I'd always wanted, but missing something essential. You and your father have shown me what that was: connection, family, a sense of belonging that has nothing to do with property or business." The legal battle with Blackwell reached its climax in early August when the territorial court ruled definitively in Vaughn's favor, confirming his ownership of both surface and mineral rights to the Double G. Furthermore, the judge referred Blackwell's case of document tampering to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. It should have been a complete victory, but Vaughn remained wary. "Blackwell doesn't strike me as a man who accepts defeat gracefully," he told Marco as they reviewed the latest mineral surveys. "I'm keeping extra men on patrol until we see how he responds." His caution proved justified. 3 nights later, Johnson discovered a man trying to set fire to one of the outer hay barns. The would-be arsonist escaped, but not before Johnson recognized him as Flint, one of Blackwell's associates. "We need to report this to the sheriff," Thea insisted when Vaughn rode to town to tell them what had happened. "I already have," he replied grimly. "Wilson made a report but didn't seem particularly motivated to investigate, said there wasn't enough evidence to connect it to Blackwell." Marco snorted in disgust. "Of course not. Blackwell probably has half the county officials in his pocket." "Then we'll handle this ourselves," Vaughn said, his expression hardening. "I've hired 2 more hands, former cavalry like myself. They'll help patrol the property." "Be careful," Thea pleaded, gripping his hand. "Blackwell is dangerous. So am I when something I care about is threatened." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry. I've survived worse than a corrupt businessman with a grudge." Despite his reassurances, worry gnawed at Thea. The stakes seemed to be escalating, and Blackwell's resources far outmatched what Vaughn could muster, even with his growing success. Her fears materialized sooner than expected. The following evening, as she and Marco were finishing supper, an urgent knock sounded at their door. They opened it to find Martha Johnson, breathless and disheveled from a hard ride. "Thank God you're home," she gasped. "There's trouble at the ranch. Blackwell's men came with the sheriff and some legal paper they claim gives them the right to seize the property for unpaid taxes. Vaughn says it's nonsense. He paid every cent due, but they're threatening to arrest him if he doesn't vacate." "I'll saddle the horses," Marco said immediately, his old vigor returning in the face of crisis. "Thea, fetch my shotgun from the cabinet." "No, Papa, you can't ride that distance with your leg," Thea protested. "You'll cripple yourself permanently." "I'm not sitting here while Grayson faces this alone," Marco replied stubbornly. You won't be, Thea said, making a swift decision. I'll go. You stay here and send word to Judge Carlton in Carson City. He's the only one with authority to overrule whatever false documents Blackwell has produced. For a moment, Marco looked as if he would argue, but then nodded grudgingly. Be careful, daughter. I will, she promised, already gathering her riding skirt. The ride to the Double G was tense, with Martha filling Thea in on the details as they galloped along the moonlit road. Blackwell had arrived with Sheriff Wilson, Flint, Reed, and 2 other men she didn't recognize. They'd presented papers claiming the ranch was being seized for tax delinquency, despite Vaughn's protests that all taxes had been paid and receipts filed. It's a transparent ploy, Martha said as the ranch came into view. But with the sheriff backing him, Vaughn's in a difficult position. He can't very well shoot officers of the law, even corrupt ones. The scene at the ranch house was tense but controlled when they arrived. Vaughn stood on the porch, flanked by Johnson and 2 other hands. Opposite them, Blackwell, Sheriff Wilson, and their men maintained a wary distance, neither side willing to escalate to violence but neither backing down. Thea dismounted quickly and moved to Vaughn's side. What's happening? She asked quietly. Relief flashed across his face at the sight of her, quickly followed by concern. Thea, you shouldn't be here. This could turn ugly. I'm exactly where I should be, she replied firmly. Papa's sending word to Judge Carlton. Blackwell noticed her arrival and smiled unpleasantly. How touching. The damaged goods comes to stand by her man. Vaughn's hand moved to his gun, but Thea placed her own over it, stopping him. That's what he wants, she murmured. Don't give him an excuse. She turned to face Blackwell directly. Mr. Blackwell, I understand you're claiming tax delinquency on this property. That's right, Miss Zanetti. Your friend has failed to pay county assessments. The law is quite clear about the consequences. How interesting, Thea replied, keeping her voice steady. Especially since Mr. Grayson not only paid those taxes but has the receipts to prove it. Receipts can be forged, Sheriff Wilson interjected. The county records show no payment. The same county records that were tampered with regarding the mineral rights, Thea countered. The tampering that a territorial judge has already ruled on. How convenient that they should be unreliable again and always in Mr. Blackwell's favor. Blackwell's smile tightened. You've got spirit, girl, I'll grant you that, but this isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you came to this house and called me damaged goods to my face, Thea replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. You made it my fight when you threatened my father's reputation. And you made it my fight when you attempted to steal property from a man I love through fraud and intimidation. The declaration hung in the air, clear and unashamed. Vaughn's hand found hers, squeezing it gently in silent support. This is all very touching, Blackwell sneered, but sentimentality doesn't change legal facts. Sheriff, I believe you have a duty to perform. Wilson stepped forward reluctantly, his hand on his gun belt. Mr. Grayson, I'm going to have to ask you and your people to vacate these premises pending resolution of the tax issue. And if I refuse, Vaughn asked quietly, then I'll have no choice but to arrest you for obstruction, Wilson replied, though he didn't look pleased about it. Before Vaughn could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. A group of riders appeared on the road. Marco Zanetti in a wagon driven by Reverend Palmer, accompanied by Judge Carlton himself and 2 territorial marshals. I believe, Thea said with quiet satisfaction, that the resolution you mentioned has arrived, Sheriff. The next hour brought a dramatic reversal of fortunes. Judge Carlton, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for incorruptibility, reviewed both the seizure order and Vaughn's tax receipts on the spot. His conclusion was swift and damning. "This document is fraudulent," he announced, holding up the seizure order. "The signature purporting to be mine is a forgery, and a poor one at that. Furthermore, Mr. Grayson's tax receipts appear entirely in order." He turned to Sheriff Wilson with undisguised disgust. "Sheriff, I'm shocked that you would attempt to execute such an obviously false instrument. Your duty is to uphold the law, not bend it to serve private interests." Wilson had the grace to look ashamed. "Your Honor, I was assured by Mr. Blackwell that the order was legitimate." "As an officer of the court, Blackwell is no officer of the court," the judge interrupted sharply. "And your failure to verify the authenticity of this document before acting on it represents, at minimum, gross negligence in your duties." He gestured to the marshals who had accompanied him. "Marshal Evans, I want Mr. Blackwell, Mr. Flint, and Mr. Reed taken into custody immediately on charges of forgery, attempted fraud, and filing false documents. Sheriff Wilson, consider yourself relieved of duty pending an investigation into your conduct in this matter." As the marshals moved to carry out the judge's orders, Blackwell's composure finally cracked. "This is outrageous. I have connections in Carson City that will—" "Your connections won't help you this time, Blackwell," Judge Carlton cut him off. "I've been building a case file on your activities for months. This attempted seizure is merely the latest in a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and corruption that ends today." Watching as Blackwell and his men were led away in handcuffs, Thea felt a weight lifting that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Beside her, Vaughn's arm tightened around her waist. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Better than all right," she replied, leaning into his strength. "I'm free." Later, after statements had been taken and the judge and marshals had departed with their prisoners, the remaining group gathered in Vaughn's dining room. Martha served coffee and the apple pie she'd been baking when the confrontation began, the domestic normalcy a welcome contrast to the tension of the evening. "I can't thank you enough for sending for the judge," Vaughn told Marco earnestly. "Your quick thinking saved the ranch." "It was Thea's idea," Marco admitted. "I just implemented it. That daughter of mine has always been the strategist in the family." Vaughn's gaze found Thea across the table, warm with admiration. "That doesn't surprise me in the least." Reverend Palmer, who had remained quiet through most of the proceedings, cleared his throat. "I believe there's a lesson for our entire community in tonight's events. We've been too quick to judge based on appearances and rumors, and too slow to stand for truth and justice." He looked directly at Thea. "Miss Zanetti, I owe you an apology. As a man of God, I should have been the first to defend your character and speak against the gossip, not merely stand aside while it flourished." Thea was momentarily speechless at this unexpected acknowledgement. "Thank you, Reverend," she finally managed. "That means a great deal to me. It's the least I can do," Palmer replied solemnly. "And I intend to make my position clear to the congregation this Sunday. It's time Marysville remembered the Christian values of charity and forgiveness we claim to uphold." As the evening wound down and their guests prepared to depart, Vaughn drew Thea aside to the relative privacy of the porch. The summer night was warm, crickets chirping in the darkness beyond the pool of lantern light. "You called me a man you loved tonight," he said softly, his hands gently holding hers. "Did you mean that, or was it just part of standing up to Blackwell?" Thea looked up at him, no longer afraid to let her feelings show. "I meant every word. I love you, Vaughn Grayson. I think I have almost since the day you walked into Henderson's store and looked at me like I was just a woman you found interesting, not a scandal to be avoided." His smile was radiant in the soft light. "I fell in love with you that day too, though I didn't recognize it immediately. All I knew was that I couldn't get you out of my mind, your dignity, your grace under the weight of those stares and whispers. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket. I've been carrying this for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He withdrew a small velvet box. After tonight, I don't want to wait any longer. Thea's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond flanked by tiny sapphires. Thea Zanetti, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I promise to cherish you, respect you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings, for as long as we both shall live. Tears of joy filled Thea's eyes, blurring the ring into a glittering starburst. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Vaughn, I would be proud to be your wife. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they returned inside, hand in hand with Thea's ring catching the lamplight, Marco took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. I suppose I should pretend to be surprised, he said dryly, but I'd be a poor father if I hadn't seen this coming for weeks. You approve then, sir? Vaughn asked, still maintaining the formality that Marco appreciated. I approved the day you looked my daughter in the eye when half the town wouldn't, Marco replied simply. Everything since has only confirmed that judgment. The wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees around the Double G had turned to gold and crimson. To everyone's surprise, including Thea's, the small church in Marysville was filled to capacity. Reverend Palmer had been true to his word, speaking forcefully to his congregation about judgment, redemption, and second chances. While not everyone had taken his message to heart, enough had that Thea found herself receiving genuine congratulations and good wishes from townsfolk who had shunned her for years. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered and updated with her own skilled needlework. Martha Johnson had helped with her hair, weaving autumn flowers into the intricate braids, and Marco walked her down the aisle with only the slightest limp, pride straightening his shoulders. Vaughn waited at the altar, his eyes never leaving her as she approached. He had never looked more handsome than he did in his new suit, his face alight with love and joy. Who gives this woman to be married to this man? Reverend Palmer asked. I do, Marco replied, his voice strong and clear. He placed Thea's hand in Vaughn's, then stepped aside with a small bow. The ceremony was simple but profound, their vows spoken with quiet certainty. When Reverend Palmer pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn's kiss was both tender and full of promise, a perfect balance of respect and passion that left Thea breathless. The celebration afterward at the Double G Ranch House was festive and welcoming. Martha and Johnson had outdone themselves with the preparations, transforming the property into a harvest wonderland with pumpkins, autumn flowers, and tables laden with food and drink. Even some of the Marysville citizens who had been most judgmental in the past attended, their attitudes softened by the obvious love between the couple, and perhaps by the realization that Vaughn Grayson was becoming one of the most prosperous ranchers in the county. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the property, Vaughn led Thea away from the celebrations to a quiet spot behind the house. A small garden had been laid out there, with benches and young trees that would one day provide shade and beauty. I had this built for you, he said, guiding her to a stone bench. A place where you can sit and read or just watch the sunset. Our own private sanctuary. Thea was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. It's perfect, she said, looking up at the stars beginning to appear overhead. Though any place with you feels like home now. Vaughn's arm encircled her waist. I have one more surprise for you, Mrs. Grayson." The name still sent a thrill through her. "The silver vein your father identified on the North Ridge. The initial digging suggests it's substantially richer than we first estimated." "Vaughn, that's wonderful news. I've set up a trust with your father as a partner in the mining operation," he continued. "Between that and the ranch, our future and any children we might be blessed with will be secure." The mention of children brought a flush to Thea's cheeks. They had spoken of family, of course, but always in general terms. Now, as husband and wife, the possibility was immediate and real. "I hope we have children," she said softly. "A house full of them with your smile and your strength. And your courage," he added, kissing her temple, "your determination and your kind heart." They stayed in the garden a while longer, talking of dreams and plans before rejoining their guests. As they walked back toward the lights and music of the celebration, Thea felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find. 3 years earlier, she had returned to Marysville broken and branded, a young woman whose future had seemingly been stolen away by circumstance and cruel judgment. Now she walked beside her husband, head high and heart full, toward a life rich with possibility and love. She had been marked as damaged goods, but Vaughn had seen only treasure. And in his eyes, in his love, she had finally come to see it too. 5 years later, Thea sat on the porch of the Double G Ranch house, watching as Vaughn taught their 3-year-old son, Marco, to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted laughter floated across the yard as Vaughn led the gentle animal in a circle, one hand firmly supporting his son's back. Beside Thea in a small cradle, 2-month-old Emma slept peacefully, her tiny face the image of her mother's. The years had brought prosperity to the Double G. The cattle operation had expanded. The silver mine had yielded consistent profits, and the house had grown to accommodate their growing family. Marco Zanetti, now comfortably settled in a cottage on the property, emerged from the barn where he'd been inspecting a new piece of mining equipment. At 62, he moved more slowly than in his younger days, but his mind remained sharp, and his expertise invaluable to the mining operation he co-owned with his son-in-law. "That boy's a natural horseman, just like his father," Marco observed, settling into the chair beside Thea. "And stubborn like his grandfather," Thea replied with a smile. "He informed me this morning that he intends to have his own herd by the time he's 6. Marco chuckled. "Ambition is a family trait." He glanced at his sleeping granddaughter. "Speaking of family, did I mention that Johnson's daughter is engaged to that young deputy from Carson City? Wedding set for spring. Martha told me yesterday when she brought over the preserves." Thea smiled, thinking of the Johnsons who had become like family over the years. "She's beside herself with excitement, as she should be. Good matches are worth celebrating." Marco's eyes grew thoughtful as he watched Vaughn with little Marco. "I remember when I was worried you might never find happiness after everything that happened. You and me both," Thea admitted. "There were times I believed what they said, that I was damaged beyond repair, unworthy of love. And now," she looked out at her husband and son, then down at her infant daughter, her heart so full it seemed impossible it had once been so empty. "Now I know that being broken isn't the same as being worthless. That healing is possible, even from the deepest wounds." Vaughn looked up then, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still as warm and genuine as the day they'd met, spoke volumes about the love that had grown between them over the years. He whispered something to their son, then lifted the boy from the pony and set him on his shoulders, heading toward the porch. "Mama, did you see?" Little Marco called excitedly. "I rode all by myself. I saw, sweetheart," Thea replied. "You were very brave." Like Papa, the boy said proudly, patting Vaughn's head. Like both your parents, Vaughn corrected, setting his son down and leaning over to kiss Thea softly. Your mama is the bravest person I know. As the family gathered on the porch in the golden afternoon light, Thea reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from rejection to acceptance, from isolation to belonging, from shame to pride. The whispers had long since faded, replaced by respect in the community for the Grayson family and their contributions to the region's prosperity. She had once been marked as damaged goods, judged and diminished by those who saw only her past. But Vaughn had seen treasure where others saw only brokenness, and in doing so, had helped her reclaim her own worth. And that, Thea thought as she looked at her family with profound gratitude, was the greatest gift of all, not just being loved, but being truly seen for who she was, both her scars and her strength. In the end, it wasn't about being unmarked or undamaged. It was about being whole, completely herself, and cherished precisely for that authenticity. As the sun began to set over the Double G, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Thea Grayson knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just a happy ending, but a beautiful beginning, a life rebuilt on love, respect, and the courage to believe in second chances.